Chapter 16, Old Rusty Truck. Everyone was particularly well behaved at dinner that evening. Wally glanced around the table at the others. Jake and Josh, he knew, were hoping that the man at the mine had never seen them near their house and hadn't figured out who they were, hoping that the phone wouldn't ring and that if it did, it wouldn't be the man telling their parents where they'd been. The girls, though, were probably hoping their dad would call from Ohio and say that they could come back home, that their power was on. They gathered on the porch after dinner, and for the first time, Jake didn't dive for the glider and try to keep the Malloys from sitting on it. If nobody's reported us by now, then I don't think they're going to, he said. That guy doesn't even know who we are. Well, I'm not going to tell that we went to the coal mine, said Peter. Don't even say coal mine, Jake warned. Then I won't even say that we went where we're not supposed to go. And besides, I didn't go in, said Peter. Don't even say that, Jake told him. Talk about ice cream or something. The grown-ups came out on the porch after dinner just to see if it was cooling off any. The Malloy girls got up so the parents could have the glider and the rocker. Doesn't seem like it's any cooler to me, Mrs. Hatford said. I get so tired of being in air conditioning all the time, but when I think of these poor folks in Ohio, I sure wish I could carry some air conditioning with me on my delivery, said Mr. Hatford. I wouldn't mind that at all. Mrs. Malloy fanned herself with the newspaper. George called this afternoon and said the power company predicts it will have power restored to everyone by the end of the week. End of the week, cried Caroline. He says it's an absolute mess. He had already stocked the refrigerator for our return, and now the milk is soured and everything has to be thrown out. Dry ice, said Mr. Hatford. The city was giving it away, but now they've run out. They're busing senior citizens who live in apartments to community centers to keep cool. And all the public pools have issued free passes. Everyone's miserable, he says. Let's just hope we keep our power down here, said Mrs. Hatford. Being in the mountains, West Virginia doesn't get as hot as Ohio generally, but this is as hot as I remember it ever being. How I wish this heat wave would break. The next morning was even worse. When Wally woke, it was as though the sun had not set all night, as though it was just gathering energy to fry the whole state of West Virginia. Mrs. Malloy offered to make French toast and bacon, but no one wanted anything hot. The 7 kids sat listlessly at the kitchen table, pushing their cereal around in their bowls. Arms stuck to sides, thighs stuck to chairs, bare feet stuck to the floor, and the air conditioning was cooling only half as well as usual because the power company was having a brownout to save fuel. By noon, the heat outside had become almost unbearable. There was no breeze at all, and leaves hung lifelessly from the trees. I'm so hot I could ignite, said Josh from the rocker. Wally lay on his stomach on the front porch and thought about that. He wondered if all the food he had eaten the night before could ever get so hot inside him that there would be spontaneous combustion. If he would just go poof and flare up from inside. I'm so hot I could jump in the river with all my clothes on, said Beth. I dare you, said Eddie. Me too, said Caroline, standing up and kicking off her sandals. And suddenly, everyone was untying sneakers and leaving them in a pile on the porch. Jake jumped off the steps and led the way, and the 7 kids swarmed down the bank below the swinging footbridge and sprawled belly first into the water. It was the only place to be on a day like this. Wally felt his t-shirt cling to his chest, his shorts grow heavy over his hips. He flopped onto his back and let the slow current carry him a little downstream before he swam back. Mrs. Malloy appeared at the top of the bank. Who's watching Peter? She called. I am, Josh answered. The rule was that nobody ever went swimming without deciding first which twin, Jake or Josh, was lifeguarding Peter. Even though the water was scarcely waist deep in most places, except in the spring, that was the rule. I hope you girls realize you have only one set of clothes left. We didn't think we would be staying here, Mrs. Malloy said, laughing up at the way they had jumped into the river wearing all but their shoes. We're too hot to care, Mom. I know what you mean, Mrs. Malloy said. I almost feel like jumping in myself. When she went back into the house, Peter said, I don't need anyone to watch me. I'll be in 3rd grade this fall. Yeah, I'll be going to middle school, and I'll hardly know anyone, said Eddie, swimming alongside him. Too bad you're not going into middle school here, Jake said. We'd keep you company. Sure, you and your bag of tricks, said Eddie. Hey, said Wally, grabbing Josh's shoulder. Look up there. Going slowly along the road above was a rusty old pickup truck. The driver was looking down at the Hatfords and Malloys splashing in the water. It's him, breathed Eddie, the man at the mine. It's like he's been looking for us, said Wally. The truck moved more and more slowly until finally it came to a complete stop. The door opened. The driver got out. 6 heads, all but Peter's, dived beneath the water. Wally stayed under until he had no breath left. Gasping, he popped up to the surface, only to see the man standing up on the road beside his truck, arms folded across his chest. Under the water, Wally went again. The second time he and his brothers emerged, along with the Malloy girls, the man was getting back to his truck. He drove slowly away, but his face was turned toward the river. It was him, said Caroline. And now he can guess where we live, said Wally. Did he say anything to you, Peter, just now? Said Peter. Did you say anything? Peter shook his head. You just stared at each other, asked Eddie. We waved, said Peter. Then he got back in his truck. They didn't feel much like swimming anymore after that. They climbed back up on the bank and stood wringing out their sopping wet clothes, then slogged their way across the road and up onto the Hatfords' porch. Mrs. Malloy was reading the morning paper in the living room. Go change your clothes and I'll wash the ones you were wearing. And when you come back down, there's something in the paper you ought to see. Jake stared at Eddie. Josh stared at Beth. Wally stared at Caroline. But Peter trotted blissfully on upstairs, leaving wet footprints behind him. We're in for it now, Jake said to the boys when they were changing, dropping their wet shorts and t-shirts on the towel on the floor. I'll bet that guy reported us the other day. Said he was said he saw some kids at the mine, and now that he knows who we are, he's probably at the police station telling them where we live. What are you going to tell Dad when he finds out? He'll probably ground us for the rest of the summer, said Wally. I don't know, said Jake. The truth is, I guess, every time we lie, it only makes things worse. They could hear Peter singing to himself in the next room as he changed clothes, then the Malloy girls going downstairs. Finally, Jake and Josh and Wally went down to see what was in the newspaper. It's here on page 3, Mrs. Malloy said, smiling. And there it was, a picture of Wally Hatford frying an egg on the sidewalk. Chapter 17. Once upon a Midnight Dreary. A breeze blew in that afternoon, and by 5 o'clock the wind had picked up, and great rolling clouds came rushing from the west. As Mrs. Malloy and Mrs. Hatford set to work making dinner, the boy's mother said, I certainly hope this is a break in the heat and doesn't just pass us by. Sometimes after a rain, things are just stickier than they were before. Here, Caroline, Mrs. Malloy called, you girls take this basket of corn out on the back porch and husk it so we can get it cooked before the power goes off. The power's going to go off here too, Caroline cried. You never can tell, Mrs. Hatford said, turning over pieces of chicken that she was frying in the skillet. This summer has been a real drain on the power companies, and sometimes we're without power for a while. Caroline could tell by the look on Wally's face that he was almost as horrified by the thought as she was. The Hatfords and Malloys sharing a house and a bathroom when the power was on was bad enough. The Hatfords and Malloys with no power at all was too awful to contemplate. Dinner went by without incident, however. The crunchy chicken and the mashed potatoes and gravy were devoured. The green beans and the sliced tomatoes and the steaming ears of yellow corn all disappeared in a hurry. There was even rhubarb pie for dessert, warm from the oven with large dollops of vanilla ice cream melting on top of the sugary crust. Caroline would never tell her mother this, but she thought that Mrs. Hatford was about the most wonderful cook there was. Toward the end of the meal, thunder rolled in like a freight train. Lightning proceeded at each boom. The crashes closer and closer together. The rain came in sheets, slashing hard against the windowpane. About 7:30, when the plates had been stacked in the dishwasher, the refrigerator suddenly stopped humming, and the lights went out. Oh no, came Mrs. Hatford's voice. Don't tell me. The lights flickered on again, then went off. Everyone waited. They did not come back on. Better get the candles, Ellen, Mr. Hatford called. I'll go light the kerosene lantern for the living room. There was just enough evening light in the sky to maneuver around the house as the Hatford boys set candles here and there, making sure they were secure in their holders. You boys get some flashlights for the girls, said their dad. What about us? Asked Jake. You know this house better than they do. I think you can find your way around all right, said his father. The boys grumbled a little, but they found small flashlights for all 3 girls, and soon candles flickered in the rooms downstairs, and moving circles of light traveled from room to room. It was sort of exciting at first, but after an hour went by, then 2, everything anyone wanted to do seemed to take twice as long. Brushing teeth, working a puzzle, reading the comics. Without the air conditioner, the humidity seeped back into the house and the temperature rose. What we need is some entertainment, Mrs. Hatford said. Tom, did anything exciting happen on your mail route today that you could tell us about? Almost ran over a cow, but not much more than that, Mr. Hatford said. If Mr. Foster doesn't keep those cows penned, he's going to lose one and somebody's going to find himself a steak dinner. Though the worst of the rain had passed, the lightning continued from time to time, and the thunder was like the low growl of a dog. Well, I think we need a little more to entertain us than a cow, Mrs. Hatford said. Does anyone know a poem or something to recite for us? Caroline knows some of the Raven by post, said Mrs. Moy. By all means, let's hear it, Caroline, Mr. Hatford said. It's been years since I've heard that poem. I remember reading it in high school, said Mr. Hatford. Caroline looked around. This was for real. This was better than the boys asking for a poem. She, Caroline Lenore Malloy, was being called upon to give a presentation. The boys started to clap. Caroline, Caroline, they chanted, even though she knew they didn't mean it. Caroline stood up and went to stand by the kerosene lamp at the coffee table. She cleared her throat and then began in her best and spookiest voice. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered weak and weary over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping as of someone gently rapping at my chamber door. 'Tis some visitor, I muttered, tapping at my chamber door, only this and nothing more. Caroline used her hands to gesture toward the front door, and their movements made shadows dance on the wall. She continued. Distinctly, I remember it was in the bleak December, and each separate dying ember wrought its ghost upon the floor. Caroline pronounced the name Lenore clearly and distinctly because she felt that Edgar Allan Poe had written this poem just for her. She placed her hand over her heart as she went on. For the rare and radiant maiden whom the angels name Lenore, nameless here forevermore. She saw Jake and Josh nudge each other and smirk. She stopped reciting, but not for that reason. I'm sorry, but that's all I memorized, she said. It's a really long poem. Why, Caroline, we got that in a book, said Mrs. Hatford. It belonged to my grandmother. Let me find it for you. She walked across the room and reached high on a shelf of the book of poetry. Caroline was pleased that none of the boys groaned. They might have been making fun of her because of her name, but deep down, Caroline felt sure they had enjoyed the performance. So she continued reading the poem, and a lonely man grieving for his lost love, Lenore, and when he went to the door to see who was tapping, he found darkness and nothing more. But the tapping continued, and just as Caroline read the line, "'Tis the wind and nothing more," there actually did come a tap, tap, tapping at the back door of the Hatford house, and everyone jumped. "A ghost," said Peter. "I think maybe we imagined it. Caroline is reading so well," said Mrs. Hatford. But no, it came again, and taking the lantern, Mr. Hatford went to answer. It was the next door neighbor asking if she could borrow a flashlight until the power came back on. "Only that and nothing more," Mr. Hatford said, grinning, when he came back to join the circle. Caroline went on. She felt she had never read so well with such expression in her life. When she came to the part where the man opened the shutter to the tapping and then flew a raven, which perched and sat and nothing more, Peter listened with open mouth. And no matter how much the man tried to get the bird to tell him what it had come there for, the raven would say, "Nevermore." "Quoth the raven," Caroline said, "nevermore." When she had finished at last, for the poem was several pages long, everyone clapped and Caroline gave a little bow. And just as though she had performed in a theater, the power came back on. Lights blazed in every room and the refrigerator began to hum. "Oh, I'm so glad to see those lights," said Mrs. Hatford. "It wouldn't be easy getting this whole crew to bed in the dark." "With that, I think I'll head for bed," said Mrs. Moy. "I'm hoping that perhaps they'll have some power back on in Ohio tomorrow. Maybe the storm broke the heat wave there." She went upstairs and into the bathroom. Caroline wanted to linger, for an actress always liked people to come up after a performance and tell her how well she had done. Indeed, both Mr. and Mrs. Hatford congratulated her on her expressiveness and interpretation of the poem. Beth went on upstairs too, and it was only a few seconds later that Caroline saw the light come on in the girl's bedroom and heard her sister scream. Chapter 18. Kaboom! Wally had started up the stairs when the second scream came, this time from Caroline. He couldn't imagine what the girls could be screaming about unless someone had been found murdered on the floor. The next voice he heard was Mrs. Malloy's. "Girls, now stop!" Wally reached the doorway first, his family close at his heels. The girls and their mother were staring at the ceiling, so Wally looked up there too. There were dozens and dozens of ladybugs. The ceiling looked like it had measles. Now what? Said Mr. Hatford. Oh no, said Wally. I've seen a few in the couple of days, but this is an invasion. What else? Said Jake. Ladybugs, girls. Get it? The ladybug dropped from the ceiling and landed on Caroline's arm. She screamed again, and when another one landed on the back of her neck, she shrieked and jumped up and down. Jake and Josh started to laugh, but Wally was fascinated by the ladybugs. The weather must have done it, said Mr. Hatford, but how they're coming in, I don't know. Through the attic, maybe? Get the fly swatter, said Mrs. Hatford. Never mind the swatter, get the vacuum cleaner. With the Hatford boys and the Malloy girls watching from below, Mr. Hatford climbed upon a step stool and holding the wand of the vacuum in one hand, he ran it over the ceiling. Zing, zing, zing with the vacuum on one ladybug after another. Sometimes 3 or 4 at a time was sucked into the machine. I'm so sorry all this is happening while we're here, Mrs. Malloy said, as though you needed one more thing. The ladybugs would have come whether you were here or not, Jean, Mrs. Hatford said, but they can really be a pain. Tell you what, Peter, I'll give you a nickel for every dozen ladybugs you can catch. Take them out in the woods and let them go, whatever, but keep them away from the house. Peter immediately started cupping his hands over the ones he found on the wall. Caroline was sobbing. I don't want to sleep in here, Mother. They'll get in my hair and crawl in my pajamas. Wally laughed out loud. He couldn't help it. Never mind her, Mrs. Malloy said quickly. Caroline, we are lucky to have a roof over our heads the fix we're in. Ladybugs aren't going to hurt you one bit. But Caroline went on weeping, and the vacuum went on sucking up bugs, and Peter kept trying to catch some and put them in a jar. Wally thought this was one of the best evenings he had ever seen. Mr. Malloy called from Ohio later, and after Mrs. Malloy had talked to him, she told the others that the electricity still had not come on in their house, but that the power company expected to have power restored to everyone in 2 more days. They were trying to restore electricity to nursing home and hospitals first, she explained. Houses, I guess, will be last on the list. We're glad to be able to do this for you, Jean. Stop worrying, Mrs. Malloy told her. The heat wave broke the next day in West Virginia. Temperatures dropped from the hundreds to the 80s, and Wally knew that if he tried to fry an egg on the sidewalk now, it would sit there undisturbed all day. Everyone felt better now that the air was more bearable, and Wally was determined to be as kind as he could to the girls for the last days they were there. When he went to breakfast, however, he saw Caroline with her hair plastered to her head like an onion skin. He stared. She tied a scarf around her head all night, Beth explained, but Wally and Jake and Josh, even Peter, giggled. With the thought that the Malloys would be leaving soon, everybody seemed more relaxed. Beth made a double batch of chocolate chip cookies for Peter and his brothers. Mrs. Malloy drove to the market for sweet corn, and Caroline and Eddie picked tomatoes and green beans for dinner from Mrs. Hatford's garden. Everyone seemed to be in a good mood at dinner. Mr. Hatford had finished his rounds early. Mrs. Hatford had been pleased to find dinner cooking when she came home from the hardware store. Peter had been busy collecting more ladybugs, and Jake and Eddie had sat down and played cards without any bickering. Now, this is what a summer evening should feel like, Mr. Hatford said, reaching for another ear of corn. And at that exact moment, there was a huge kaboom that shook the house. Wally almost leaped out of his skin. Peter dropped his fork, and several voices at once cried, "What was that?" Because Tom Hatford was a part-time sheriff's deputy, he had a two-way radio, and immediately he leaped to his feet and rushed to turn it on. He stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the dining room, listening on the static and the excited voices and confusion coming from the speaker. Ray, Mr. Hatford kept saying, what have we got? What exploded? I don't know, Tom. Larry says he sees smoke coming from east of town, and we've got a car on the way. Wait a minute. It's the coal mine, Larry says. Son of a gun, we got a call coming in saying there's been an explosion at the old coal mine. Wally stared at his brothers, then at the girls. Why would anyone have done that? Mrs. Hatford said. Why, nobody's used that mine for years. Who would do it? That's what we want to know, said Mr. Hatford, grabbing his keys and rushing for the door. The peach cobbler that Mrs. Malloy had made for dinner sat untouched on the kitchen counter. Well, it's not the end of the world, Mrs. Hatford said, puzzled. As far as the sheriff and the police can tell, no one was hurt. Come and eat your dessert, and we'll know more about the mine when Tom comes back. I'm not very hungry, said Wally, getting up from the table. Me neither, said Eddie. Maybe I'll have some later. Caroline and Beth and Jake and Josh left the kitchen too, and only Peter stayed in his chair, heaping on the ice cream and spooning the warm peaches and cream and crust into his mouth. Now what, Ellen? Said Mrs. Moy. You'd think they were the ones who blew up the mine. The shopping list, Wally said. Right, said Jake. We've got to show it to Dad. Where is it? I don't know, said Wally. He thrust his hand into his right pocket. Nothing there. He stuck both hands into both pockets and searched around with his fingers. Nothing. What were you thinking the day you found it? Think, Wally. My other pants, Wally said. I was wearing shorts, I guess. They were in the hamper and Mom's washing clothes tomorrow. Wally made a beeline for the basement stairs. Caroline and her sisters followed. What's going on? Asked Mrs. Hatford. Nothing, said Wally. They thundered down the basement stairs and over to the heaping baskets of dirty clothes by the washing machine. The boys tore through the clothes, sending shirts and towels flying this way and that, until finally Wally held up the wrinkled shorts he had been wearing for the past week. He dug in the pocket. Success! He held up the worn slip of paper triumphantly and read, eggs, rope, tomato sauce, flashlight, dynamite. First class evidence, said Jake. Not quite, said Eddie. Why not? Eddie pointed. There on the stand next to the washing machine was a bottle of bleach, a bag of clothespins, and a large blue container of detergent. The red and yellow label said, Dynamite, for all your wash day needs. It was about 9:30 when Tom Hatford came back with his clothes dusty. Well, all we can tell is that some person or persons set a charge at the entrance to the old mine and sealed it up. What we won't know until we get a crew out there tomorrow to haul some rock away is whether there was anybody in there. Wally had never thought of that. You mean it might be murder? He asked. All I'm saying is that somebody had a reason to close up the entrance to that tunnel, and we won't know the reason until we find out who did it. We're checking with every explosives place around here to see who they've sold to in the last week or month. We asked the residents out near the mine if they'd noticed anything out of the ordinary. People go back there from time to time to fish the river or climb the rocks. They dump some old tires, maybe, or a broken stove. He stopped suddenly, facing the row of kids sitting on the sofa. You know, you guys don't look so good. A little green around the gills, if you ask me. Do you know anything that might give us a clue? Peter came out of the kitchen holding his second bowl of peach cobbler, licking the back of the spoon. Jake gave him a warning look, and Peter said softly, I won't tell. Wally's heart sank. Tell what? Asked his father. What I'm not supposed to, said Peter.